Flooding, drought, and wildfire. More extremes, more often.
You can't deny what we're seeing right now.
We're basically setting ourselves up for a worldwide catastrophe. And it's going to come to fruition in our children and our grandchildren's lifetimes.
And time is running out.
So in terms of where the clock is, I think we have a decade left.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Chief Meteorologist Braden Long.
And I'm meteorologist Danielle Miller. We've heard about climate change for decades, but after hotter summers, warmer winters, and stronger, more destructive storms, it isn't going away.
Just 2 decades ago, 2 out of 3 Americans agreed that climate change was a concern across party lines. But it remains a hot-button political issue across the country and here at home in South Central Pennsylvania. In the next half hour, we're going to show you how long scientists have known about climate change, what is keeping us from moving forward on it more quickly, and how you at home right now can help slow it down.
We begin our story at a divide. Like the changing levels of the Susquehanna River, belief in climate change seemingly ebbs and flows in its brief history. And even among those who believe, a divide about what caused it or what to do about it.
Because we have real serious decisions to make. And until we understand the nature of what's happening in our backyard as a result of global climate change, we're not going to be very capable of making the best possible decisions.
Dr. Edward Maybeck is a public health communication specialist at George Mason University. He now focuses on crisis communication for climate change because our warming climate is now a public health issue.
Our skin in the game is quite literally our skin.
But first, a history lesson.
Legend has it that NASA climate scientist James Hansen testified in front of Congress on a sweltering DC July day in the summer of July of 1988, I believe it was, and he issued a very clear warning that human-caused climate change is a reality, and that it is going to create problems of cataclysmic dimensions unless we do something about it.
At the time, testifying in front of a committee meant captivating a large audience. Scientists thought that should have been enough.
As scientists, our job is to understand the world, to do research to help understand the world better. We don't necessarily think of our job as to figure out what to do about how to fix problems that our science reveals. The fact that there was a clear wake-up call issued in the summer of '88 was helpful, but not sufficient.
In 1997, then Vice President Al Gore traveled to Japan to negotiate the Kyoto Protocol, committing the U.S. to reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
The interesting thing about the late 90s is there was no difference between the way conservative Americans and liberal Americans thought about the issue.
Still, little had been done about the big problem.
They saw it as a distant problem. Distant in time, like maybe 2100 or maybe even 2075, but not 2010. Distant in space, sub-Saharan Africa, sure. You know, my community, nah. And distant in species.
But in the early 2000s, partisan divides became deeper. Rhetoric became more divisive.
The next big wake-up call was issued in 2006 when An Inconvenient Truth came out. And it was a very clear signal. It got a lot of attention. It had an inconvenient truth. The inconvenient truth had an inconvenient truth to it, and that was it was an idea, a warning, brought to us by a Democratic politician.
Since then, we've seen interest and support for climate change rise and fall, depending on who was in office.
America not only recognizes our role in creating this problem, we embrace our responsibility to do something about it.
It'll start getting cooler. You just watch.
I wish science agreed with you.
Well, I don't think science knows.
During the Obama years, there was a fairly sharp increase in public concern. During the Trump years, there was a bit of a decrease in public concern, especially among conservatives.
Coming up.
It's a wonderful thing to be the world's richest industry because it spins off lots of extra cash that you can use to make sure that things are going to go well for your industry in the future.
Just what role did oil and gas companies play in the debate on climate change, and do they still today?
Your money is going to organizations that are against the fundamental values that you claim you stand for. Don't you think you have some obligation to monitor where the money is going?
Mr. Woods, CEO of Exxon, do you agree that climate change is real?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Lawler, CEO of BP America, do you agree that climate change is caused by human activities?
Yes.
Mr. Worth, CEO of Chevron, do you agree that burning fossil fuels is a significant cause of climate change?
We accept the scientific consensus that the use of fossil fuels contributes to climate change.
Welcome back. Last month, executives from Shell, Chevron, BP America, and ExxonMobil all testified in front of the House Oversight and Reform Committee. And they faced some tough questions about how their companies contributed to climate misinformation and how they may still today.
James Black was an Exxon scientist, and I'd like to put up on the screen what he told the company's top executives in a secret briefing back in 1978, more than 40 years ago. And he said, and I quote, "There is a general scientific agreement that the most likely manner in which mankind is influencing the global climate is through carbon dioxide release from the burning of fossil fuels."
10 years before NASA scientist Jim Hansen testified, Exxon scientists suspected the impact carbon dioxide release would have on our environment. But according to the Oversight Committee, in 1996 and 1997, then CEO Lee Raymond publicly stated that scientific evidence was inconclusive and that the case for global warming is far from airtight.
I'm asking you, Mr. Woods, do you agree there is an inconsistency between what Mr. Raymond, the Exxon CEO, told the public and what Mr. Black and Mr. Cohen, both Exxon scientists, told top executives?
Chairwoman, no, I do not agree.
And they weren't the only company aware of the issue.
Before even in the 90s and 80s, we were aware of reports that were out there. There was a lot of science. There was a lot of debate that was published during that time period. But I would say that BP focused on the landmark IPCC study in 1996.
That study then directly attributed climate change to human influence. And while the CEOs repeatedly testified that their respective companies' positions held with the science at the time, actions spoke otherwise. All Big Four companies are members of an organization called the American Petroleum Institute, or API. That group seeks to advance the cause of and lobby for the fossil fuel industry.
And they're really having an impact. You know, they're spending millions of dollars in Congress to kill electric vehicles. And they're spending millions of dollars against the methane gas. And you could do something here. You could tell them to knock it off for the sake of the planet. You could end it. You could end that lobbying. Would any of you take the opportunity to look at API and say, stop it?
Chairman Khanna, what I'll commit to is continuing to be an active member of the API.
While oil and gas companies acknowledge climate change exists today, the money hasn't flowed to Washington, D.C. In the last 10 years, oil and gas companies have spent nearly $500 million to lobby for legislation. And out of nearly 5,000 attempts to effect it, they've tried to only further climate change policy 8 times, 0.17% of their total efforts.
Unlike what they were telling us previously, which is this isn't a problem, now they're admitting it's a problem. So in a sense, they're telling the truth, but they're telling a very selective version of the truth.
Part of that truth includes the formation of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. The group claims to battle climate change and search for renewable sources of energy. Why?
The thing that climate scientists were warning us would happen, that our weather would start getting worse, it's becoming increasingly obvious. People get injured and or killed during extreme weather events. And there are a whole variety of different ways in which climate change is harming the health of Americans across the country already.
Coming up.
There are people and companies that don't want that message to be delivered because they're profiting by not having that message delivered.
We know where the message was lost, but how has the science changed and what comes next?
In terms of where the clock is, I think we have a decade left. We're basically setting ourselves up for a worldwide catastrophe. And it's going to come to fruition in our children and our grandchildren's lifetimes.
Welcome back. I'm meteorologist Danielle Miller. Just like the communication of climate change has evolved, so has the science. But there's a key difference between then and now. Now we can see it, we can feel it, even if you don't quite believe it.
Climate change is something that is happening. We are seeing it even locally, regionally. We're seeing this. Projections are telling us this is happening.
We often talk about climate change on the global level, and for important reasons. However, we're far enough into this climate crisis that we're already seeing the effects in our area.
We thought of disasters as, say, a tornado happening, and then emergency responders would rush to the scene and they would respond to the disaster. They would help everyone. They would, provide them with food and whatever else was needed. So now more and more emergency managers are looking at long-term disasters.
Dr. Seppi Yalda is both a meteorologist and the director for Millersville University's Center for Disaster Research and Education. For her, the definition of the word disaster has changed.
Differences in the seasons themselves, but also the length of the seasons changing.
Drought, heat waves, heavy rainfall events, and more of all of them. Extremes, rather than just a usual weather pattern.
10 of the warmest years on record have happened just in this century. By year 2035, we're seeing, over 3 degrees Fahrenheit of temperature increase, which is actually a larger temperature increase than we are going to see anywhere in the United States.
Science is kind of easy. It's simply that we're creating an energy imbalance by the things that humans are doing on the planet, and that energy imbalance is translating into changes in the climate system and changes in consequences.
Dr. James Kinter III is the director of the Center for Ocean, Land, Atmosphere Studies, or COLA. Admittedly, at the beginning of his career, the science wasn't always as well understood.
In those days, the problem we had was we couldn't separate the signal from the noise. But now, since the 1990s and really the 2000s, there's just no question the signal has emerged from that noise. We know that the rate of change is faster than it's been in probably 2 million years. And we know that the amount of change is more than could possibly happen from natural causes.
By rate of change, Dr. Kinter means the temperature is changing more quickly than it should be because of natural causes alone.
Instead of taking tens of thousands of years or even millions of years to change, it's happening in decades. And that's because human activity is perturbing the climate system. It's basically changing the entire equilibrium energy balance between how much energy we get from the sun and how much energy the planet re-emits into space.
As we continue to put carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we disrupt the natural carbon cycle, creating the energy imbalance Dr. Kinter mentioned. We feel some of those effects already.
The temperature has already gone up here by more than 1 degree Celsius over just the beginning of the 20th century. The other thing we've been seeing, which is really enormous for us, is precipitation. So we've had something on the order of 5 or 6 major multi-inch per 6-hour rainfall events just in the past 2 months, July and August of this summer.
The rest of that energy imbalance hasn't been accounted for yet, but it lurks close to home.
The ocean takes a long time to warm up. It's big, it's made of water, which has a high heat capacity, and it absorbs energy for a long, long time before it comes into equilibrium. So the ocean will continue to warm up and continue to warm the atmosphere as a result for decades after we stop changing carbon dioxide concentrations.
That means even if we stopped cold turkey all output of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we would still feel it. It would still get worse.
Even if all the countries of the world keep their promises made in Paris in 2015, we only have about an 8% chance of keeping it below 2 degrees.
That's 2 degrees Celsius. Agricultural stress, longer allergy seasons, lower air quality, extreme and more frequent hazardous weather conditions. What's beyond 2 degrees? Unthinkable. Beyond that number, we reach the point where economic and health impacts are simply devastating. Remember, Dr. Yalda said we're already expecting to see an increase by 3 degrees Fahrenheit by 2035 in Pennsylvania. That's 1.7 degrees Celsius, 14 years from now, right in our backyard. Not some faraway place, not some faraway time.
You can't deny what we're seeing right now.
In terms of where the clock is, I think we have a decade left.
Gridlock. That partisan divide shown here at home. What concerns keep us from moving forward more quickly to combat climate change?
The marketplace is where you should see that development occur and that transition occur, not from government policies that create regressive tax policies and create more corruption and bureaucracy that take away from the people.
There has to be a social and political will to do this.
I remember when I was a kid talking about a coming ice age, and there was this talk about us running out of oil at some point that was going to create a huge crisis.
State Representative Daryl Metcalf has a well-documented history of opinions on climate change. He's been quoted as saying the effects of climate change are chicken little fear-mongering, something he still does today. Rep. Metcalf has served coal and oil-rich Butler County for 23 years. He's also in his second term as the chair for the House Environmental Resources and Energy Committee, playing a role in what legally shapes our environmental future. And as a politician, he is a trusted voice of the constituents who voted for him.
There are no climate deniers. Everybody recognizes there's climate change. Now, what is the cause of that climate change? And what's the solution, if we need to have one, to deal with any consequences to climate change?
Rep. Metcalf said back in 2019 when taking over as chair that he would allow, quote, good Republican legislation to come to a vote. And as of October, 27 items have come to a vote, all Republican.
The narrative that's been created to try and demonize people that are opposed to ultimately the solution that they're pushing for increased regressive taxation on our citizens, to have them entrusted with what they're claiming is a solution.
Metcalf's solution? A team of appointed experts brought in to testify on proposed legislation.
When you're going to develop a policy, you should be taking into consideration good science. And that's why we've had experts come before the committee to talk about what's going on within our atmosphere, what's happening with climate in Pennsylvania.
Back in June, those experts appointed by Metcalf included testimony from Gregory Whitestone, Dr. David Legates, and Dr. Patrick Michaels. Whitestone represents the CO2 Coalition, funded by the energy industry and those who oppose climate change mitigation. Legates now works for the Heartland Institute, a think tank backed by those who oppose the scientific consensus on climate change. Michaels also receives funding from the oil and gas industry, among other organizations. And Representative Metcalf's biggest donors as recently as last year continue to be oil and gas companies, including Marathon, Exxon, and Chesapeake.
That influence who you bring into the committee. And by that I mean these experts who are funded by oil and gas, as opposed to somebody who may be more solar progressive, more wind progressive, to kind of hear that.
Well, my position is that this false narrative that's been created to tell people that they need to suffer because humanity is responsible for all the climate change that we see, that they're going to be the end of themselves and that they should suffer through regressive tax policies, and they should trust these people in the government, that they should trust them with implementing with their money the projects that will actually facilitate the solution. So I'm going to look for folks that actually are more aligned with my understanding of what's occurring.
Many like Metcalf don't believe the U.S. should further climate change legislation when other countries aren't making the same effort.
China is continuing to burn coal. 50% of the world's coal, I believe now, that they're burning. So while people want us to stop burning coal, they're putting us at a disadvantage.
Legitimate point, China has increased output to record levels as America has reduced it. But it points to a bigger question as we see the evidence mounting. Which do we put first? Economic or environmental policy to shape our future?
Being on the wrong side of science is bad for the country. My hope is that we can pull the issue of climate change back out of the culture wars in America, and we can start dealing with it like adults again and looking at the evidence of what our problems really are and what the best possible solutions are. I think that's what makes this country great.
We should be doing everything we can to be good stewards of our environment, to make sure that we're using the energy we produce efficiently, effectively, which is what we've been doing, which is why you've seen CO2 reductions in Pennsylvania.
One good steward of the environment is Eric Souder. He's a Lancaster County native and founder of Regional. That organization is helping shape the roles rural and urban communities play in our environment. He's not interested in the politics of Harrisburg or Washington. Souder says he knows what's right in front of him.
I'm much less concerned about whether people believe in climate change. I'm much more interested in how we can work together to make a better world. I've had a number of farmers that have told me about how they've seen the changes. One farmer said things aren't just different from when my grandfather farmed this land. They're different from when I took over 10 years ago.
And he sees a clear path forward.
Climate solutions are really the angle and the way that we need to approach any kind of climate action, because it empowers us to see things that we can actually do, and often they are win-win.
A win for both science and the wallet.
Some of those solutions are the ways that farmers are taking care of soil health and storing carbon in soils, the way that they're managing plants and animals, integrating them into the land as well. So in addition to the ecological benefits, many farmers are able to reduce costs of their operation and add new revenue as well.
Perhaps an opportunity for our area to not just play catch-up, but take the lead.
I think Lancaster is positioned to be a climate leader. It's a place that is known for its ruralness and its urbanness, and places that embody both of those identities are right now missing from the national climate conversation. And so I think it's a real role that Lancaster can fill and prove something really important to the nation.
As the debate continues on how much and how quickly we should transition to cleaner forms of energy, that doesn't have to stop what you do in your community.
I've traveled across south central Pennsylvania, meeting residents who are doing more and more unconventional things to help clean their environment. You'll be able to see their stories on air and online at fox43.com.
From the Fox 43 weather team and all of us at Fox 43 News, thank you for joining us.